for this. Welcome, everyone, as you're popping in. Feel free to pop your name and your location in. We even do a few people. Pop your name and location in the chat room so we kind of see the diversity of geographic diversity of where people are coming in from. I can tell there is by the few people I know on here already. If this is your first time coming to one of our events, let me quickly introduce myself and Ligare, and then we'll get right to our program. I'm Hunt Priest, and I'm actually am a priest of the Episcopal Church. It's my last name and my vocation, which is confusing, but that's just the way it is. I'm stuck with it. And I have been a priest for about 20 years, 19 years, and have served churches in Atlanta and Austin and Seattle and Savannah, where I currently live, Savannah, Georgia. And about 2 years ago, I took a break from parish work to start a nonprofit work educating and networking at the intersection of psychedelics and Christianity. I had the wonderful good fortune of being part of a research study involving religious professionals, that is to say clergy, mostly from the world's religious traditions. That study, I was in that study in 2016. The results of that will be coming out soon. And as a result of that, I just had a very strong sense of vocation to help bring this forward, the healing and the spiritual growth and transformation that psychedelics offer. As part of that, as part of the transformation, which is the point of our first one of these theological book groups, book studies, is that it's not all, as I say, unicorns and rainbows. There are difficult parts of this, and we have to be honest about some of the challenges that some people have with psychedelics, and that's the topic for today. I want to introduce our first guests, two wonderful people to kick us off. We're so fortunate to have Rachael Petersen and Dr. Charles Stang from Harvard. Rachael is currently a student at Harvard Divinity School, and she is also the Psychedelics and Religion Program Director at the River Styx Foundation, where she builds programming to support clergy interested in all of this work at the intersection of religion and psychedelics, and does research with NYU and Hopkins. She came to psychedelics after participating in her own study around psychedelics and depression, and really was prompted by her years of work in climate change and environmental destruction. She came to that study at a very critical time in her life. She's written lots of things, including the article we're looking at today, A Theological Reckoning with Bad Trips. She's also published poetry and nonfiction, and her works explore themes of despair, personal and planetary crisis, and conversion. She has a degree in anthropology and environmental policy from Rice University. And again, she's a student at Harvard right now. Dr. Charles Stang joined the faculty at Harvard in 2008. His research and teaching focus is on the history and theology of Christianity in late antiquity, especially Eastern varieties of Christianity. More specifically, he's interested in the development of asceticism, monasticism, and mysticism in Eastern Christianity. His most recent book is Our Divine Double, published in 2016 by Harvard University Press. And his current projects include a book on the problem of evil in Christianity and Neoplatonism, entitled Beyond God and Evil. In 2017, he became the director of the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard Divinity School. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Stang and Rachael Petersen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hunt. Thank you so much, Tim. And thank you so much, Rachael, especially, for writing this amazing piece in the Harvard Divinity Bulletin, which I think I've read now 3-4 times and heard once, or heard a version of it. It's powerful, and I'm so glad that it's getting read and discussed, and this seems like a one forum for just that. I'm going to ask you a really open-ended question, which is for if you could tell the group what led you to write this piece. Why did you feel moved to write this piece? And if you could reflect on what resources you found in the tradition, especially the Christian tradition, as you were trying to make sense of this experience in light of maybe the shortcomings of the therapeutic model that you encountered.
Great. Well, thank you, Charlie, and thank you, Hunt and Tim and Ligare, for hosting this important conversation. It's an honor to be speaking about this. I haven't spoken about this article in many venues, but I trust that this is a venue where all of you will engage this conversation really productively. So thank you for hosting me and for reading my piece. So this question of why I wrote this piece, there were really three motivators for writing this and for publishing it as well. For those of you who don't know or maybe didn't read the piece, as Hunt mentioned, I was in this Johns Hopkins trial for major depression using psilocybin, and that trial administered 2 doses of psilocybin 1 week apart, high doses. And these were my first psychedelic experiences that I'd ever had in my life. And the first experience I had was really quite profound, and in some ways was very stereotypically mystical. And we'll talk about what that word means in the context of psychedelic trials soon. And after I had that experience, I felt better than I had in my whole life. I felt, like my life had meaning. I could connect with people better. I appreciated beauty and art and nature. But when I went back a week later, my second experience was radically different and left me with enduring negative effects and functional impairment that were quite challenging. And as I was asked to talk about my experience in the trial, I really only focused on that first experience. And some of you may have seen my first article that I wrote about how it really converted me from being an atheist to being a believer of sorts in and something beyond myself. And as I saw the psychedelic movement really taking off, I started to feel more and more uncomfortable with the fact that I hadn't really given a nuanced picture of the full extent of my experience. And so I took the risk of writing this. And I do say it's a risk because there's a lot of pushback around talking about negative experiences, but I do feel like it's imperative as more and more people have access to these medicines to give a full picture. So that's the first kind of basic reason is my own integrity. The second reason was, after this experience, as I write in the piece, a lot of people, out of, well-meaning people out of good intentions kind of threw a lot of platitudes my way. And I think these are platitudes that are also very common in the Christian community. Something bad happens to you and it's God has a plan, or, sometimes in this case, you get the trip you need, not the trip you want, or sometimes the most challenging experiences are the most meaningful. And I was hearing this discourse, and what struck me was that it was really resonating with a lot of the reading I was doing here at Harvard Divinity School in a class on suffering and evil, and how, especially in the Christian tradition, people have had to reckon with what do we do about the fact that bad things happen if God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and benevolent, right? Well, how do we make sense of this? And it was really striking that people like, Leibniz, who said, this is the best of all possible worlds, God must have a plan, that his words were resonating with people who were speaking to me from the psychedelic community. Folks like Origen, who conceived of God as sort of a doctor who, as we suffered, was sort of mending our souls or helping us heal or become better people through our suffering. So I was really struck by that and wanted to explore that more. Is there a sort of unspoken theodicy at play here? And then finally, my final motivation for writing this piece was that if you look within psychedelic clinical trials, there is a contingency of researchers and people who really put forward this notion that the reason that psychedelics are so effective for things like depression and anxiety and alcoholism is what they call, the mystical type experiences that can be occasioned by these substances. And when you look at the metric that they're using to describe what is mystical, it has several components. It's, noetic. It gives you this sense of encountering something that is more real than real, that is more true than true. It's ineffable. It can't be put in words. It's transcending time and space. And it also, by their definition, has to be accompanied by a positive mood. And when I looked at my 2 experiences, my first one really hit all those criteria. My second hit the first 3, but not the positive mood, but it felt no less, ultimate, absolute. It definitely shifted my reality, my understanding, my kind of core beliefs. So who's to say that that's not mystical? So I started to unpack, what is this particular scale that's being used? What's the lineage of this scale? And we can talk about that a little bit more if helpful. And what are resources? Are there resources in religious traditions to help make sense of encounters with the ultimate that don't just make you feel better, right? Maybe knowing God is not therapeutic, and maybe the notion that it should be is actually a really modern notion. And so in the piece, of course, I talk about the tradition in which I have practiced the most and know the best now, which is in Buddhism. There's quite a bit of resources both in scripture as well as now in contemporary research into the way that meditation and really intensive meditation can cause extensive functional impairment. All the way back to, we have medieval monks who were sitting in caves who couldn't stop sweating and laughing and crying and shaking for sometimes months and months at a time. So there really was this idea that to be engaged in an endeavor to know the ultimate, or in Christianity, God, isn't necessarily fun, right? And maybe I'll take a breath here, and maybe cue up The Dark Night by St. John of the Cross, because I do think that's a framing that gets thrown around as potentially useful for these challenging experiences. But maybe before I do, Charlie, I'll see if you want to get in or respond to anything I've said so far.
Well, what I want to respond to, first of all, is just a message I've received that my internet is unstable, as the timing is perfect. So what I'm going to suggest instead, Rachel, is that you go on to your second point about John of the Cross, and I'm going to, in the meantime, try to shift to a different Wi-Fi here at the university in hopes that that will resolve it. So if I disappear, I'll be right back. Okay. Great. But why don't you carry on, and then I'll, if I disappear, forgive me.
Okay, great. So I'm sure many of you have heard this phrase, the dark night of the soul. And this is a phrase that I heard as well when people were helpfully attempting to kind of give framing or meaning for what I was experiencing. And popularly, people use this phrase, the dark night of the soul, to describe, pretty generally, when a person of faith or when a person who's a spiritual seeker encounters difficulty or feel that they've been abandoned by God. But I actually want to take a few moments to go into detail about St. John of the Cross and his original notion of the dark night, because I do think it's very valuable. But I think the Christian community, if we're going to offer this as a frame to help people make sense of what they're experiencing, that we have to have, fidelity to what the original kind of context of this idea was. So for those of you who don't know, St. John of the Cross was a 16th century Spanish mystic, Carmelite. He was very good friends with Teresa of Avila. And he wrote a poem called Stanzas of the Soul, which describe this process of union with God, right? And he, for his, in his framing of contemplation and many other medieval mystics, the ultimate goal is union with God. And in this poem, he's describing a process, a step-by-step process of unifying with God. And the poem is elaborated in two commentaries, the Ascent, and then the Ascent of Mount Carmel, and then the Dark Night. So the Dark Night is the title of the commentary. It's not actually the Dark Night of the Soul. He doesn't use that phrase at all. But the idea is that this is a step-by-step process where you conform your will with the will of God, right? And are we back? We have it back. Okay. Hey, Charlie. And so basically, this is a process of what he calls purgation or purification, and there's 4 steps to this process. There are active steps that the contemplative has to do themselves, and then there are passive steps that come after the active steps that God undertakes, right? So you as a contemplative undertake a sort of priming so that God can come in and work through you. And this happens in 2 stages. There's the dark night of the senses, and then the dark night of the spirit. And so basically this process is one in which, in the dark night of the senses, there's this sort of active night of the sense where you have to move beyond appetites, right? Like correcting and restraining desire. So getting rid, shedding love of things, love of senses, He talks about being too attached to an over-decorated rosary, for example. So all of the kind of appetites one has to get rid of, the passions like joy, fear, sorrow, and imperfections like pride. So that's, is the contemplative actively getting rid of those things, right? And then God comes in the passive night of the sense and gets rid of any enjoyment you might derive from spiritual practice, right? So in the active night of the sense, you get rid of sensual pleasures. And in the passive night of the senses, God comes in and is like, nope, like I'm actually going to remove myself from your life. So you can't even get any joy or pleasure or sensuous, satisfaction from spiritual practice. John of the Cross is actually quite a detailed and nuanced thinker. So this is going to be a very cursory overview. But so that once your senses are gone, it's like, okay, but you still have your spirit, which he describes as being, known and constituted through understanding, memory, and will. And his whole premise is that, God is beyond our understanding, ultimately, completely beyond our understanding. So we actually have to get rid of our faculties of understanding, memory, and will. Like we have to purge ourselves, empty ourselves as much as possible of these sort of constructs and concepts. And so he actually uses the word annihilation and self-annihilation like 33 times in this text. So once you really start to clean up house, the active night of spirit, then God comes in the passive night of spirit and completely transforms your soul. And he describes this as being burned in a fire or having like hot metal poured into your marrow. And this kind of final stage is when you realize that your finitude is so irrelevant alongside God's infinitude, that it's just such a painful realization, to realize that sort of utter nothingness. But that's the only stage. You have to get to that stage of complete emptiness and annihilation to actually be unified with God. And I'm sort of belaboring this because I think it's important to realize that, this is a process that St. John of the Cross is describing. It's an intentional process and a contemplative process. So it's a bit of an anachronism and unfair to just take someone who has had something bad happen to them or who is struggling and say, oh, it's a dark night. Because a dark night, it really only happens through these intense steps of intentional contemplation and self-negation and self-purgation that, St. John of the Cross says can take years and years, right, to get to that point where God is actually working in you because you've worked on yourself. So I'll take a breath there. And again, I do think it actually is a useful frame, but it's a frame that is describing an intentional process of a very experienced contemplative who St. John of the Cross emphasizes should probably have some sort of director or experienced teacher who's leading them through this process. So, but Charlie, I know you are very familiar with mystics who maybe people on the call have not have heard of before, and I'm curious what resources you look to in the tradition for this.
Well, thanks, Rachel. First of all, I want to say thank you for nuancing John of the Cross, and because, first of all, I don't know John of the Cross all that well. Most of my attention is on earlier and more Eastern mystics than John, but he's so often cited and in a kind of platitudinous way, or so it seems to me, where he's reduced to a single phrase, as you said, the dark night of the soul. And my worry about the way in which he's cited is that talk of the dark night of the soul suggests that it's merely a stage on the way to dawn. And that seems very amenable to the kind of what you call the post-traumatic growth narrative. Like, don't worry, this is just the dark and it will soon get better. Persevere more and the light will soon come. And it's one of my frustrations, in fact, with this discourse around mystical type experiences occasioned by psychedelics is that what we're loosely calling the kind of mystical archive of Christianity attests to experiences that deliver anything but a consistently positive mood. In fact, quite the opposite. Proximity to the divine is often experienced as harrowing and dark and deeply challenging. But before I launch into perhaps some lesser known figures than John of the Cross, I want to just register that what I think is most important about your piece is its insistence on the inescapability of this, the incomprehensibility of this experience. That is, that it can't be comprehended, it can't be held, that it escapes explanatory frameworks, whether those are psychological and therapeutic or theological. The theological paradigms that I'm going to discuss, I think, can also be, frankly, I'll use this word, weaponized to in just the same way if we assume that they can explain or explain away the experience that you've had. So I'm going to speak of these not in the spirit that they somehow account for what you experienced, but instead as frameworks of fellow travelers through the centuries, frameworks of people who have had experiences and have sought out the wisdom of their communities of discernment. In Christianity, these are largely monastic communities, for help in holding what are astonishingly challenging experiences. So none of these frameworks that I'm going to share are meant to be exhaustive, but instead invitations for you or for anyone else on this call, or for those of you who are in a pastoral roles, for people who may come to you with such challenging experiences, whether they were induced by psychedelics or by other means. So having said that, I'm going to start with a figure from the Russian tradition, then move west, and then move much farther east. So I don't know if the name Vladimir Lossky is known to anyone on this call, but he was a 20th century Russian Orthodox theologian, very famous for bringing the Eastern Orthodox tradition, the riches of the Eastern Orthodox tradition, to the West. He was part of the Russian emigre population in Paris that fled the Bolsheviks. In any case, he has a book called The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And in that book, which is a beautiful book, he's not, like many Eastern Orthodox theologians of the 20th century, he is a bit of a polemicist against the West. They're trying to fight for attention, and one of the ways they can get attention is to polemicize against the West, the Western Christian tradition. And he actually targets St. John of the Cross and others in that tradition for speaking about divine abandonment. And he targets them, or he criticizes this tradition as, he says, basically, these Western Christian experiences of being abandoned by God are either abnormal or even pathological. And he regards the ultimate root of these, of this sort of Western fascination, or fascination with abandonment. The root of that is in our theological anthropology. That is to say, our understanding of the human being. He doesn't say this explicitly, but he's quite clear. He's probably targeting Augustine and the notion of original sin that seems to fund at least so much of the Latin Western tradition. In any case, it turns out that Lossky is wrong. There is actually a pretty vibrant Eastern Christian meditation on spiritual abandonment, but it's not so much in the Greek tradition itself as it is in the Syriac tradition. But I'm actually going to, before I speak about the Syriac tradition, which is a particular interest of mine, I'm going to tack back to the West for a minute. You've just helped us recover John of the Cross and nuanced him. I want to bring up a figure who's perhaps lesser known, who's a woman named Marguerite Porete, who was burned at the stake in the year 1310. She fell afoul of the power to be, in no small part for being a woman, and presuming to be a spiritual teacher. She was a beguine, if anyone knows that name, that term. Names a kind of spiritual adept and teacher that falls out the traditional monastic orders. Men and women were beguines, and these were, this was a tradition that really flourished in France and Germany and in the Low Countries in the High Middle Ages. In any case, Marguerite was what's called a wandering beguine. So she was a kind of itinerant teacher. And you can imagine an itinerant woman teacher is vulnerable to all kinds of suspicions of heterodoxy. And in fact, she fell, as I said, she fell afoul and was burned at the stake. Her theology was wildly influential on Meister Eckhart. But I'm not here to talk about her legacy, but to try to speak about one thread of her theology that pertains to your piece. She gave a kind of itinerary of our soul on its way to union with God. And it's a 7-step itinerary. But she introduces a distinction in this itinerary between souls that are lost and souls that are sad. And in fact, lost is where we start. And sad is where we need to be. So sadness is actually a stage, a mark of a profound spiritual maturity, according to Marguerite Porete. Lost souls are those that persist in the error that they have their own being, and therefore they take the pleasure and happiness in their own being. Sad are the souls that have understood that their being is, in relation to the Creator, a kind of nothingness. So very much what you were saying with John of the Cross, who embark on a practice of progressive annihilation. So sadness is not something to be fled, it's something to be pursued. And it's a pursuit in the service of an annihilation in which one's will eventually becomes annihilated into the divine will in an act of love. And that annihilation is experienced as a kind of profound suffering, but also a profound state of understanding. So she is someone who I think could plausibly be added to the list of resources in the West. Again, I'm not endorsing this view. I'm not saying this answers, but it's someone who, it's an important witness in the tradition, someone who recognized sadness not as a sign of sin, but as a sign perhaps of a particular proximity to the divine. If any of you are interested in reading further about Marguerite Porete, there's a very good English translation of her readily available in paperback in the classic Western Spirituality series. And her book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, is it's really something. And she was, it's quite something. So that is, along with John of the Cross, a figure from the West I'd like to bring to the group's attention. But I'm going to come back now to Losky, because as you said, you recall, he said, this is something pathological about the West. The West is somehow stuck in this miasma of divine abandonment. And in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, there is no celebration of divine abandonment because God does not abandon his people. Well, if you look further east to the Syriac tradition, we get a slightly different story. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, the Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic, and there have been Christian communities speaking and writing in Aramaic from the 3rd century until today. The Syriac tradition has dwindled in recent decades and centuries, but you can still find Syriac worshiping communities in Iraq, Iran, and throughout the Middle East. ISIS did a number of the remaining communities in those countries, but they are still Syriac speaking and Syriac worshiping communities. But the tradition was quite vast and stretched all the way from Turkey to China for many centuries. In any case, one of its features is a very, very robust tradition of ascetical, mystical theology. you may be surprised to hear that that centered around the Persian Gulf. So what today Bahrain, the UAE, and Qatar is an area sprinkled with Christian monasteries from which some of the the luminaries of this tradition hailed, including perhaps maybe the only name I'll mention that is known to some of you, and that is Isaac of Nineveh, is actually from the Persian Gulf and wrote in Syriac. Okay, in any case, Lossky did not really, this Russian who is writing on the Eastern Orthodox tradition, privileging the Greek world, did not really study the Eastern tradition in Syria. One of my students 15 years ago wrote her master's thesis on the theme of divine abandonment in this tradition. In the Google Doc that Tim has composed, you can find a link to it if you want to read more about it. So on the first thing that's important is just a recognition that there is such a tradition in these communities of discernment. Why? Because this is not a theoretical question for them, it's a pastoral urgency. This is a tradition deeply invested in practice and theorization of what they call mystical prayer or pure prayer. And in this practice, so it seems, monks are experiencing divine abandonment, and so those who care for them have to respond to these experiences. And what we have in this tradition is various ways of framing that. So I think that in and of itself is a significant fact, right? This is something that happens. And in these communities of discernment, abbots and other spiritual directors have to find a way of holding it. And I think I want to introduce a distinction between how do we hold those experiences without trying to explain them away? How can we hold them in mystery? How can we bring the truth of scripture and the resources of the tradition to help us live with, unpack, and deepen our engagement with those experiences without giving too easy or trite explanations that try to empty them of their edge or their abysmal depth. Okay, so just a few notes then on the details of that tradition. Again, if you want more, that article is a great place to look. So the fact is that they do raise the question of, well, perhaps this divine abandonment is a result of the sin of the prayer. They accept that as a possibility, but they generally downplay it because in fact, I think they understand that many of the monks who are experiencing this, there doesn't seem to be any obvious sinful root for this. So that's one explanation, one reason given. Another is that the monk might experience abandonment as a cause of salvation for others. There's also the idea, that's a second. The third is that the divine abandonment might manifest, you might experience this precisely to reveal hidden virtue, the sense that there are further resources, there's further virtue to surface in the monk, and the experience of divine abandonment will motivate him to manifest that. There's also an explanation, a possible explanation that divine abandonment can occur to teach humility, not so much as a punishment for pride, not so much that the monk is suffering from pride and needs to be humbled, but rather as a preventing those who are already virtuous from losing humility. So the sense that monastic humility is precarious, and periodic seasons of abandonment prevents you from taking your humility for granted. And then finally, that abandonment is understood as a necessary step for spiritual development. So I'm going to mention a few here. A few figures in particular. John of Dalyatha, he again comes from that same region of the Persian Gulf. He develops this idea by seeing the experience of divine abandonment as the second of three stages of spiritual progress, and a relatively advanced and rare one at that. So again, something to be sought, and maybe not sought, but because I think recognizing something as advanced, as perhaps an advanced stage along a path, doesn't mean that everybody should seek it. I also think that's a really important piece that you, Rachel, bring out. You can plot it on an itinerary and say, maybe some people aren't ready for the experience of divine abandonment. Right? There is, I think, a sense that everyone, I mean, this is again a frustration I have with some of the psychedelic conversation coming out of therapeutic contests, that everyone, insofar as they can, should be, take a rocket ship into the Godhead. These communities, these monastic communities, deeply devoted to prayer, are much more concerned with staging that. How do you build a life of practice that can sustain some of these experiences? It's not so much about trying to reserve it for just the elect few, but recognize that these experiences can be so powerful, so overwhelming, so hard to hold, that you need the appropriate scaffolding in place. So again, kudos to you, Rachel, for saying that. Isaac of Nineveh, as I mentioned before, he says the experience of abandonment is actually a normal part of Christian experience. He doesn't speculate on the reasons for it, but he gives a detailed description of this experience, and admits that in this state, prayer may be impossible. That is to say, there may be times where abandonment hinders or hamstrings your ability to pray. Now, he regarded these as relatively brief, but obviously that's not the full story, because as Rachel has described, some of these this experience of abandonment can persist for months, and maybe even color one's prayer life or life of praise forever thereafter. So I just want to recommend those as two possible places, west and east, to dig in. I'm sure they're not exhaustive, but I also want to commend you for bringing us back to Scripture and Job, because I think Job is a fantastic figure for refusing the temptation to explain, which, just like Job's friends do, and just like Job's friends step in to explain his sufferings, just like well-meaning therapists will step in to explain, and so will some well-meaning theologians. I really do appreciate and commend the way you ended this essay, in a spirit of open and curious, but also honest suffering, unknowing. So thank you.
Yeah. Excellent. Rachel, we're gonna break into small groups, but I wonder if there was anything you wanted to add or respond to that.
I think the one thing I'll add is, this, in thinking about St. John of the Cross describing what is ultimately a submission of the will, and like loving God not for the sake of love, but for the sake of God. Like, I think a lot about Jesus and like the agony in the garden, where he's like, take this cup, like, I don't want it, like, I don't want it. And I think we've lost, in the way that we've lost, some of the Old Testament kind of like the fury and the demands of God's will. Like, it's not fun, right? So yeah, just bringing back that spirit of like humility of,
Can I respond to that really quickly, Hunt?
Yeah, sure.
Because that's one thing I thank you for saying that, mentioning Gethsemane, because Losky actually says, even though he's polemicized against West for being obsessed with divine abandonment, then he says, well, I suppose it does have a kind of root in the Gethsemane experience. But then he immediately pivots back to the Transfiguration. And he says, and he champions the Transfiguration. And I just want to commend you again for, raising the question of, are we pulled between Gethsemane and the Transfiguration? Right. What is the place of the Gethsemane experience, or for that matter, Lama Lama Eloi Sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? Where is the place of forsakenness if our Savior utters it from the cross? How do we understand it in our own lives?
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
In a real practical theological perspective, I think that's kind of where American Christianity is in a lot of ways, is that it's really only about the Transfiguration or Easter as another example, and then Good Friday is like difficult spiritual experiences or grief or sadness is just not seen as part of the tradition anymore. And I think what you all have done, and in fact, in some ways, what psychedelics can do for people is bring us back to it's not all Easter. It's not all Easter. So that's good. Well, we're going to break into small groups for discussion. Our guests will be in groups too, and Tim McMahon King's going to put us in those. He did post a Google Doc. I'd encourage it. That'll stay in the chat, I think, in the small group. So to access that, some questions for your reflection, and then we'll call you back in with about 35 minutes to go. So, or 30 minutes. Let's say, Tim, do you think that's enough time? 15 minutes?
Maybe give 20 minutes for discussion and come back.
20 minutes. We'll do the usual Zoom thing and give you a minute warning. Then we'll just pull you back in to the larger group. But we'll give 20 minutes in the small group, and please stay on. And then we'll come back and do some wrap up and some final thoughts. So thank you all. All right.
Thanks. Well, so I want to check in on sort of like the scope of our discussion, because Rachael, I like some of my questions might pertain to your experience, but I also want to respect that might not be what you want to go into. So I guess I'm already putting you on the spot, but I want to check in about that before asking any questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's my experience of people responding to this piece is that it's natural to want to get more details about the experience itself than what I disclosed. I will say you can ask questions right now, but I reserve the right not to answer them. I feel like I wrote the piece, so that's what I wanted to share, but you feel free to ask and see.
Well, so one of the things you're advocating for, which I think is important and helpful, is for us to have a more robust vocabulary around a phenomenological vocabulary and categories for what takes place in trips, and particularly bad trips, negative experiences. And if I understood your story right, it was these experiences which led you into exploring theology, spirituality, div school. And so it seems like you've certainly done your homework in developing a vocabulary in that regard. Now that you have it, like, are you thinking about those experiences in new ways? Or like thinking about potential future experiences in new ways, or wanting to respond to people who have had similar negative experiences. So I guess I'm wondering, it seems like you have some of the vocabulary. Where do you see yourself wanting to use that? Kind of how can we think about employing things like that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, yeah, I didn't have any of this vocabulary in terms of thinking about, divine abandonment or annihilation, or even the kind of apophatic strains within religious traditions whereby, proximity to God can be measured by emptiness or nothingness. So I think this whole conversation is like evidence of a vocabulary that I didn't have and that Divinity School has given me. I think the most immediate and simple answer to your question, though, and I've done some work on this with others at Emory and elsewhere, is, as you know, Adam, hopefully bringing more chaplains into this conversation. I don't think they're going to solve the problem. I don't think all chaplains are like amazing theologians who are equipped with all these different frames. But in terms of harm reduction, if we are going to be administering these medications, these medicines within clinical settings, there are people who are already in those settings who are equipped to be spiritually reflexive and hopefully not impose their own beliefs, and those people are chaplains. So I'm super curious to continue to see that as a bridge area to bring those conversations together.
All right, good. Thank you. Ron. McNutt.
Yeah, I was wondering because I've had experiences when I was younger that were really mystical, and then later on, I had some experiences. One of which was so intense that it made me take a pause from psychedelics, and then recently I've had a 5-year experience with multiple ayahuasca administrations, and I can't help but think that there's a process with the medicines, like the archetypal stripping of the bones at some point, the loss of personality, and the sense where you reckon with your own negativity so much that you start to have to adapt to the light that's showing you. Because it seems to me, and I never know when I go into a psychedelic experience, this could be my last. This could be the medicine telling me that, you're not, what are you doing here? Get out, But it just seems to me that this is a process that can bring about positive transformation where you don't tend to go back into the dark spaces of feeling loneliness. And I was wondering if either of you could comment on that.
Yeah, so I would say that I think the thing that I'm really trying to do with this piece, and just fundamentally in most of my work, is like hold down space for multiplicity and nuance. And I think that what you're describing, the kind of hero's journey, is pretty well accepted in the psychedelic space. It's saturated with kind of Jungian archetypal psychology, and these models are really well accepted. And of course, yeah, absolutely. There are people who may go through a really challenging experience and it may yield transformational benefits. I'm not saying that's not true in this piece. I think what I'm trying to do is expand the territory, or widen the territory a little bit for alternate models. Like maybe the abyss is just the abyss and it doesn't lead you anywhere. And maybe some people have that experience, and how do we not devalue that or impose a model on it that is not the one that they're experiencing? So yeah, I'm validating your experience and the model you used to make sense of that, and also holding down that there may be other people who don't. So I don't know, Charlie, if you have anything to add to that. But
I mean, I'm just generally thinking about the variety of means of inducing altered states, and we're here talking about psychedelics, and Ron, you were saying you have your own sense of when you want to step back and then step back in and engage. And I think maybe we could ask the same question of other practices that we engage in. I mean, Rachael raised this with respect to meditation. Just as we see in certain corners of the psychedelic world, so in the world of meditation, more intense. Is that, and whether is it prayer? I think actually there's probably a lot more wisdom around this than we think if we widen it out from just talking about psychedelics and think about how in our lives do we know when and how to lean into certain kinds of practices and when to step back from them. At least that's how I have a rather modest bandwidth of experience with psychedelics, but in that modest bandwidth, it's not been like a consistent acceleration. Like I had some really powerful encounters, and then I just wanted to hang back, and I'm still working that out. And that's the case with other practices I've had over the course of my life.
and out of full disclosure too, and people are sometimes surprised to hear this, after reading the piece. So I stopped meditating for 2 years because every time I sat on the cushion, my whole body, it was like just a traumatic response. I went back into that place that I had experienced. But now I do sessions. I will sit in silence for a week, and there's sometimes edges of that are scary for me, but I only could come to that place after 2 years of discernment and stepping away. Mm-hmm. So as Charlie said, being in a community, especially a community of people that aren't just saying more, better, faster all the time, and really holding you and discerning when and how. Yeah.
Again, please raise your hand. I'm trying to watch this, so please raise your hand.
Padma's got a question.
Okay, go good, Pablo. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, and I just wanted to thank both of you for this, and especially Rachel. I wanted to thank just express my gratitude that you cited Eric Davis in your footnotes, and particularly, I mean, his writing around like this sort of abyss, like phantasmagoria that hovers around the edges of psychedelic weirdness and also meditation. And the reason why I mentioned that is because one of the questions I had as I was listening and also as I was reading your piece is that within the Christian, the sort of the diversity of Christian practices, particularly amongst evangelicals and also specifically amongst charismatics, there are a broad range of technologies of transcendence and like this huge field for the experience of like the extraordinary encounter and the extraordinary experience. And something, and I apologize to the people in my small group because I already said this to them, so it's a repeat for them, or raised this question, but this is also true amongst like non-charismatic evangelicals, like this whole space of like spiritual warfare and all the phantasmagoria and like the ugliness of like this sort of demonic encounter that is possible to experience in that space. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is because certainly, at least in my experience and observation in that space, there's a wide field for experience for the phenomenological, but an extremely narrow space for making meaning out of it afterwards, theologically and also in terms of just of religious practice, like communal practice and community making. Like this, the interpretive space is extremely narrow. And it occurred to me that part of what you're describing and part of what both of you have brought up here is precisely also a similar kind of conundrum emerging in the space of the self-identified mystical and progressive psychedelic, that there's like a narrowing of the interpretive possibility post-experience and a narrowing of the space for paradox, contradiction, and holding some of its soteriological promises a little bit lightly. And I was just wondering if like you could talk about like what kind of like as you're working through this and like what kind of space you see for opening up practice, interpretive practice after the encounter, after the event, that can hold space for paradox, that it may be possible that there could be multiple ultimate realities, that like everything that you've encountered is equally ultimate and that you can make some discerning choices about where you want to swim in that. Like, have you been finding like a broader set of resources for that?
Not in the academy. No, I'm teasing. I mean, yeah, so what I heard in your question is like, where, if I'm understanding it correctly, where are the spaces to widen the interpretive possibility while also honoring like the realness of the encounter and the sort of discernment? I mean, I look to people like, the work of, I said it's not in the academy, but I think the work of Eric Davis and Jeff Kripal are probably two of the people that I've found to be most liberating and both taking seriously the realness, but also not prescribing or reinscribing the meaning of the realness and holding that multiplicity. I'm gonna punt this one to Charlie while I think about this a little bit more. But I think my response is showing that there's not many spaces in which to do this. Yeah.
So I'll second Eric Davis and Jeff Kripal, who are both friends and whose work I read and whom I adore. So one of my frustrations around the psychedelics and mysticism, the crossroads of psychedelics and mysticism, is that I fear that there isn't an accelerationism at play here, where psychedelics are understood to afford a trip to the highest registers where we encounter God, and I don't know that is what psychedelics should be used predominantly for. Or at the very least, I don't want to launch over what we'll call the middle registers, what's between where we find ourselves and, let's say, the source. And I think in some cases it's a matter of getting past this idea that there's a heroic dose that will deliver you into the lap of the Godhead. I'd rather see people exploring lower dose and entering what I'm going to call, following Henri Corbin, imaginal realms, and getting comfortable navigating more proximate worlds than the world of the source. And in some sense, this is going back to the kind of roots of American psychedelia. And in some sense, it's honoring indigenous traditions' use of psychedelia, which recognizes there are layers of reality to explore that may expand the envelope of our consciousness, but don't immediately try to go to the highest register. Again, back to this issue of staging and scaffolding. Now, I'm speaking in part personally. I myself don't really want right now to launch into the lap of the Godhead. And I think in those middle registers, there's great training we can have for thinking about symbol and interpretation. And that, anyway, Padma, that's where I am. Yeah, I'll stop there and see if Rachael wants to add anything.
Well, I want to name the specter of something that's been looming in this conversation. We've been talking about like these experiences in the context of theodicy, and what theodicy defends or describes or explains is suffering, but is also evil, right? And there are people in these experiences who, especially, I don't know, it's kind of classically like DMT, who will encounter entities that are perceived to be evil, right? Or that is part of the interpretive frame. And I'm sure, as you say, in the charismatic tradition, there's a very narrow kind of discernment. Is what you experience divine or is evil? But I'm just naming another absence, which is spaces of really reckoning with, like, what do you do with a real experience that is innately perceived, not even appraised to be, but felt to be demonic, right? Threatening, not of the one, not of the source, of some other realm, of some other substance. So that's something that, I feel like there, especially in the charismatic community, there's probably structures for discernment and sense making, but they're also pretty narrow, right? So where I'm not even sure where to look for a broadened frame of like encounters with evil. Yeah, but it worries me.
And I want to say, I think there's a space between the assumption that the divine source is good, and then that there's some sort of like evil other,
like Manichaean, right?
Yeah, there can be kind of malevolent or nefarious entities in the middle that might not be encountering evil itself, but that we have to learn, that you have to learn to navigate like we do in this world. Anyways.
And the final thing I'll say on this is, and oh gosh, I'll remember his name in a moment. There's a great anthropologist who's been writing, I think his book is American Set and Setting. Part of the problem too is this issue that psychedelics are, impressionable, right? So people are reading about certain archetypical experiences, like mystical experience, the mystical experience questionnaire, and that's priming them to have certain experiences that they didn't then have language for. So this sort of narrowing of the interpretive frame might also be meaning there's a narrowing potential of even experience if the theory is that the interpretive frame is actually reifying or priming a certain type of experience. So there's like a feedback loop happening as well, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. Megan, thanks you all. That was Padma for the question. Megan?
So speaking of demons, it feels like a flip side of a conversation that we haven't had today is the ways in which the therapeutic community, the clinicians, are really in the deep end on naming some spiritual experiences like unattached burdens, if you're in the IFS model, that traditionally is not a part of clinical training. It's been well outside of clinical training to do that. And I guess I'm wondering if you all can comment on the role of the church in, I don't know, tempering the therapeutic tendency to maybe go beyond its, I don't want to say beyond its purview, like it's like this is our territory or sort of thing, but also like where can we be showing up, or should we be showing up, or should we be worried or about that sort of shift in the therapeutic community to, say you're possessed in so many words, albeit clinical terms.
I'll tell a story that Rachael heard. Rachael, correct me if I got this wrong. It was from Dawn, who was talking about a session at Kinesis where there were they were like kind of, for lack of a better word, like secular therapists, and then there were, I can't remember, were they Rachael, well, I'm gonna tell the story and you're gonna help me get the other group right. Basically, somebody went into one of these sort of psychedelic settings where largely done by therapists, but the person reported being possessed by a spirit. Okay. And there were two kind of guides in the people sitting with the person were the therapists, and then they reported to the other guides who were part of this gathering. And the second was trying to frame it and kind of like, okay, you're having a hard experience, like, but here's how we work with that. And then they reported that to the other guy, and they were like, wait, you just had somebody report that they were possessed. Like, you have to intervene. There's things to do when that happens. And it just threw up, like, there are these two worldviews that we're pretending just kind of like are seamlessly going to integrate. They don't. One of the groups doesn't think those things are real. And so when they show up, their reaction to them is so different than folks whose worldview includes the reality that there may be entities that are malevolent or whatever. You have things you have to do in those circumstances. And I don't know how to solve that. I just want to, it's like reflects back, like, hey, this is a problem that we have to acknowledge and not just say that it's just going to be smooth sailing to integrate secular therapy and traditional religious practitioners when, forgive my French, when shit goes down, like you've got to know what to do.
And I think part of that is, like, to use a fancy word for all of you who are in leadership roles in the church or otherwise, in academia, is like a sort of ressourcement. Like, the reality is that contemporary religion is, with the exception of the charismatics, I could argue, contemporary Christianity is not great with like transcendent experience, period. Like, it's not, right? So can you all, as people in Christian communities or congregations, like, go back into your tradition and look at what resources do we have? Okay, when a possession happens in the history of my tradition, what did people do? Or when someone had a transformative encounter with God, what happened? What were the mystics saying? And go beyond the usual mystics, like go beyond the known entity. So really, I think your question of where can you show up is like, look within your own tradition to see what resources could be on offer. Well,
good. Thank you. Luke, we just got a couple minutes. You had your hand up and I want to honor that. And if you want to go ahead and ask a question, then I've got a little bit of wrap up. So if we can just keep it short.
Yeah. Real quick. First, if I ever saw what Ezekiel reported to see while I was on something, I don't know that I would interpret that as being good. That would probably frighten me to death. And it really resonates with me, what you've been talking about, Rachael. I'm in a discussion group about Julian of Norwich right now, and her story goes hand in hand with the way that you're relating John of the Cross to that. And even more so with perhaps the high fever causing her to see things that weren't really there or altering her state of mind. I wanted to say something, Dr. Stang, which you had mentioned about lower doses. My passion lies in that and finding theological language to kind of tie that together with repentance. When I was a kid, my grandfather would always say, don't drink, don't smoke, don't chew, or go with people that do. If you do all that stuff, or if you don't do all that stuff, then you're a good Christian boy. And I think a lot of things in the West, particularly in charismatic and evangelical circles, revolve around formulas very similar to the tradition of the elders in the New Testament. So if I'm viewing repentance from this place of changing the way that you think, and the purpose of changing the way that I think is to better understand how God sees me, how do these substances interact with my brain to make that happen? So my focus is more so on that than what I can see, how I can come to God, trying to move away from the Leary and Warhol language of you're going to have this encounter that otherwise would have taken you 50 years to pray for, and then maybe get a little piece of it. So I'd be interested to hear from both of you. What sort of roadblocks do you think would come up? I'm on a year break now, and then I'm going to be entering a THD program in the 2024 academic year for this purpose. So I'm just interested, what sort of roadblocks do you think would come up in trying to tie those two together and create a theological language for their use in pastoral counseling and clinical settings?
Rachel?
I actually feel like this is a Tim and Hunt question in a way. I feel like, no, to be completely honest, I'm not meaning to be glib. I do feel perhaps not as in touch as I would need to be to answer this question in terms of like the Christian community and roadblocks that would come up specifically. You mean kind of like cultural roadblocks?
No, I mean more in the academy.
Oh.
Yeah, in the academy, what sort of things, what sort of pushback would there be from more traditionalist or orthodox practicing professors?
Really depends on what corner of the academy you're in. You're going to encounter different roadblocks, Luke. So, yeah, I mean, where Rachel and I are, there's a general suspicion of transcendence, a really powerful suspicion of transcendence. And there is, as I'm sure you all know, a kind of, all those changing, there is a strong residual distrust of psychedelics. And the reasons for that are hard to quite understand, but I have theories, but this isn't the time for that. So anyway, I think it would really depend what kind of place you're going. Can you just say for a moment, are you comfortable telling us where you're going?
Yeah, well, I did my master's work at United Theological Seminary in Dayton, Ohio. And they're kicking off their THD. They'll finish the accreditation this year, and they're kicking off their THD program in 24. So I was planning on that just because I'm familiar with the faculty there.
Yeah.
I was a teacher's assistant most of the time that I was there, and but haven't gone.
You're gonna encounter different roadblocks than you will at Harvard Divinity School, and I don't really feel like I'm best able to speak, but yeah, I think maybe Rachel's right. That might be more of a Hunt and Tim question, but good luck.
Hunt and I have had these discussions. So.
Great.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Yeah, good luck for all of us. I do want to remind everyone this will be available, as the recording will be available. We'll have it in our newsletter. It'll be on our YouTube channel. And again, so much thanks to Rachel and Charlie for your time and your wisdom and your work you're doing on this. And I feel like we're just at the beginning of these discussions in a way. And for me, one of the things that really standing out is this: the clinical and the spiritual religious have never been able, on any topic, we're not really very aligned. So there, and I think psychedelics are forcing that in a way, and I think that's helpful, but we're just a long way to do. And it's forcing the more scientific and academic to have to actually even say the word God, and it'll force some in the religious and spiritual tradition to really take serious the academic work on this. And there's still parts of Christianity that don't believe in therapy. So, I mean, I'm not sure. I'm still in this. I'm still in it, and I want to be because of what I think it can do. But I think we've got a lot of work to do. Spiritual directors are going to be really important. I think chaplains are going to be really important, and to get Christian leaders at least to understand the current science and to understand where it went wrong in the 60s and 70s would be just a big win anyway. So that's sort of the basic stuff I'm working on. Real quick. This summer, there are going to be 3 opportunities to engage the topic of psychedelics and religion. One is the MAPS conference in Denver in June. And a few other people will be on a panel there around psychedelics and religion. The Wild Goose Festival in North Carolina, which is a Christian outdoor festival of music and conversation and presentations and food and beer trucks and music, that's in in July in North Carolina. That psychedelics and other parts of drug policy will be on the agenda there. And then the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago will also, so June, July, and August will be an event where this will be a topic. Denver, near Statesville, North Carolina, and then in Chicago in August. So look for those events if you're anywhere close to those. If you're anywhere close to Nashville, this weekend, I'm going to be in Nashville at Second Presbyterian Church on Saturday, presenting around psychedelics and Christianity. Ron McNutt, who's on the call, asked me to come. Ron, if you could quickly tell us what time. I meant to look and I didn't.
It's at 3 o'clock, 3 to 5 o'clock in the activity center. And no charge, donations accepted. No cameras, no recordings. Everyone's going to be able to talk freely.
Second Presbyterian in Nashville. Thanks for organizing that, Ron. So on that note, I'm going to end our session and thank everyone for being here, for the questions. Certainly thanks to Tim for organizing this and for Rachel and Charlie for kicking us off with such good style. It was a wonderful conversation.